If you're in a lot of pain, either physical or emotional, then this is for you. This video is perhaps the most personal that I will ever make. Forgive me if I seem emotional or I express myself imprecisely. I find talking about this particular subject slightly more difficult than others. I have a condition that causes me an awful lot of chronic pain. At times it can put me in really quite serious suffering for days, and it has caused me to spend months mostly in bed. Doctors are still not sure what's causing it, they can only see the physical damage in its wake. And I have mentioned this before on the channel, but today I want to tackle it head on, and let you know the philosophy that brought me some comfort, consolation and wisdom when I was at my lowest. Most of this video is based on journal entries during the months-long period where my pain had truly reached its peak. I'd lost a lot of blood, I was constantly exhausted, and I didn't have the energy to do much of anything, see much of anyone, or take really any pleasure in life. I say this not to grumble, my pain is not particularly special, but rather to just set the scene. Suffice to say, it was a cheery old time. Here I'll be revealing the philosophies that helped me most to cope with my pain. You will discover some of my deepest flaws, and I hope to dispel a common assumption about crafting a personal philosophy. Bear in mind that this particular video will be less objective and academic than many of my others. I can't promise that you will find it helpful or even particularly insightful, but it is an honest account of what philosophy brought me at my worst. So, let's get stuck in. 1. The torture of uncertainty. There is an understandable human tendency that many of us, myself included, have when times are tough. We immediately leap to wondering whether it will ever get better and dreading that it won't. The possibility that this is just life now floats in our consciousness, tormenting us by occasionally withdrawing the small salve of hope that is keeping us going. This constant wavering from hope to despair back to hope again can add a new layer of suffering to any negative experience. It certainly did for me. For these months, I barely left the house or even my room, in too much pain to do anything that I enjoyed. In such a state, the uncertainty of if it would ever end became borderline oppressive. And it was here that I began to profoundly resonate with Camus' idea of an absurd world. A world which we desperately want to find meaningful, understandable and comprehensible, but offers us back only arbitrary chaos. Although Camus seemed to use the absurd to talk about the human longing for meaning coupled with the universe's stubborn refusal to give up the goods, the same structure can apply to all sorts of existential dilemmas. For me, it made me realise that my longing for certainty about when my pain would end, whether it would get worse in the future or whether it could be fixed, was only compounding my suffering. Difficult as it was, I had to face the fact that the way that I was approaching my pain was only making it worse, and I would have to get used to being unsure about how I would feel for the foreseeable future. It hammered home the idea that the universe truly did not owe me anything. And this paradoxically made me feel a lot better. It transformed what at the time felt like a great cosmic injustice into something perfectly ordinary, and thus slightly less terrifying. And this was not the only counterproductive approach that Camus helped me dispel. In the middle of the myth of Sisyphus, Camus has an often overlooked discussion about the value of experiences. He says that if we're truly going to cope with the meaninglessness of life, then we need to stop making quality judgments about what we're going through. In other words, a situation might feel physically unpleasant, but we only add to that mental upset by pointing at it and going, that's bad. While this might be helpful if it is a soluble problem, if it's instead something that we just have to endure, then all it does is impose a needless negative evaluation on what is already a less than stellar situation. Ever so slowly, I began to withhold negative judgment about my pain. This was in some ways a dangerous philosophical road to go down. Value too many things, and your life becomes a flurry of forces pulling you each and every direction, threatening to rip you in two. But value too little, and it can be difficult to picture why you're even going on. But this notion of abandoning value judgments helped me an awful lot at a time that was both painful and very uncertain. It put things in perspective. Who was I to be so arrogant as to pass negative judgments on mere experience? For all I knew, they could end up being immensely positive in the long term, and at the very least, I could show my respect by not heaping condemnation onto them. After all, it didn't stop the pain, it only added mental stress to be the garnish on the shit sandwich. However, along with my predicament came a change in my own behaviour that I found both repellent and deeply unsettling. And a great Russian thinker helped me nip it in the bud. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then consider subscribing to my email list or my Patreon. The links are in the description. 2. Being in pain without being a pain. In Notes from the Underground, Dostoevsky describes a type of person that we can all recognise, both out in the world and in ourselves. It is the person who relishes having a toothache because they will get to torture everyone else with their pain. They will writhe on their bed, howling and groaning, thinking that if they are to be forbidden rest, then everyone else must be as well. It is the attitude that says, if I can't be happy, then no one can. And to my shame, I caught myself falling into some of these patterns. I remember one night I was eaten up inside with frustration. I had not slept in 3 days because of pain, and I felt hot anger mixed with complete exhaustion. In my state, I was filled with spiteful hopes that others would be brought down with me. That if I was going to be this miserable, then why shouldn't the rest of the world join me? I felt the bitter sting of resentment prick at my spine, and I began to indulge it. For days I would skulk around in this state, simultaneously filled to the brim with hatred for anyone that was happier than I was, yet also profoundly envious that they seemed to have the comfort that I was being denied. This pushed me further and further into isolation, until I was lashing out at the people who loved me the most. It was then that I began to remember the protagonist from Notes from the Underground, and was horrified at how familiar he was starting to look. I was also deep into Nietzsche at this point, and I remembered a passage from the Antichrist that was, surprisingly, singing the praises of Jesus Christ. Nietzsche was speaking of the qualities of the biblical figure that he most admired, and chief among them was his lack of resentment. What made Christ stand out from others, according to this arch-critic of Christianity, was his unique ability to bear suffering without a hint of resentment or envy. It hammered home to me that my resentment would never help my situation, but was instead only making it worse. Instead of making the best with what I had, I was using all of my energy seething at other people, taking a sort of pointless revenge against people that had done me no wrong by inflicting my foul moods upon them. And letting go of this resentment was genuinely difficult. It is psychologically scary to witness others going on with their lives, developing, changing, enjoying, while yours seems frozen in time. We've all had some version of this, but little by little I worked to see the happiness of others not as a personal jibe or an object that I could covet or envy, but instead as what they were. Happy events that were simply not happening to me. I am hardly the first to point out that happiness is not a zero-sum game. It seems obvious to say out loud, and it's easy to believe when we are calm or joyful. But when we are scared or upset or in pain, we can slip into seeing the joy of others as if it was intentionally twisting the knife of our own suffering. If you would have asked me if I was a resentful person before this period, I would have told you very confidently that I was not. And yet it turns out it was there all along, waiting just under the surface to strike when I became unhappy enough. I may think that I'm past this tendency for resentment now, having had this condition for many years, but deep down, I'm not sure if that's true. I think that for most of us, our struggle with resentment is something that we'll continually face through our entire lives. We will think we have won the battle when times are good, only to realize that our enemy was hiding, waiting for when life got tough again. It was Nietzsche and Dostoevsky who made me acutely aware just how vital it is to get a handle on our resentment before it eats us alive. But perhaps the most persistent lie I told myself when I was basically bedbound is, I can't do anything in this state. And that was when our next philosophy leapt to the rescue. 3. Bad faith and freedom. One of my favourite observations by Jean-Paul Sartre is just how much pressure it is to be free. He was writing at a time where, more than ever, people were struggling with the question of how to live without God telling them the blueprint for a good and meaningful life. Arguably, we are still in the thick of answering that question for ourselves. But in his book, Being and Nothingness, Sartre points out that to live without objective meaning is neither a paradise nor a prison, but comes with important pros and important cons. One of the most notable cons being the crushing effects that such freedom from objective values can have on someone. Being fundamentally free comes with total responsibility for all of our actions, and that is a truly frightening concept. It means we have no one to blame when our choices backfire. It means whatever we're going through, it's up to us to deal with it. It means we cannot say that we had to make a choice out of obedience to God or to morality. We instead chose to take a certain course of action and must now deal with the consequences. Sartre noted that people often run from this reality by pretending that they are less free than they are. They would give themselves artificial boundaries so that they could avoid responsibility both for their actions and for their lives. Everywhere he looked, people went, I had to do it. I didn't have a choice. We escape from the pressure of freedom by imagining external forces curtailing our choices. And I began to notice this tendency in myself. When I was at my sickest, I caught myself indulging in self-deceptive tricks that were only making my condition less palatable. I would tell myself that I could not read or write or think because I was in pain, and that pain would distract me. Like all the best lies we tell ourselves, there was an element of truth here, because the pain was actually distracting, and it did prevent me from doing a lot of things. However, upon closer inspection, there wasn't anything preventing me from trying to read or to study. And while I might not get as much from it with the pain impeding my concentration, it was hardly a waste of time. In some ways, I learned more in those months mostly in bed or slumped on the sofa than I had in the previous 3 years. But I had got so used to the habit of not being able to do things that I applied the same bad faith thought to any possible activity, without stopping to check whether it was actually true. And it was this that really got me thinking. Since then, I have been constantly trying to work out what my unconscious habits of thought are. What judgments do I make that on the surface seem perfectly reasonable, yet on closer examination are actually just a knee-jerk reaction lazily applied to a situation where it isn't appropriate? I have a big list in my notebook, and they range from huge, unevidenced assumptions about the motivations of other people to simple things like habitually thinking that if I didn't understand something in the moment, then I just never would. Learning to recognize these thought habits has been very helpful in giving me a clearer view of when I'm rationally approaching the world and when I'm just indulging in sluggish thinking. I'm by no means perfect. I still have loads of work to do on this, but I can now much more easily recognize when I have managed to fool myself into thinking that things must be a certain way, even when there's no evidence that that's the case. And it was Sartre's notion of bad faith that set me on the path to doing this. Again, it's very easy to offhandedly say that we probably all have bad habits in our thinking that are worth eliminating, but Sartre really brought this notion to life and helped to identify the kind of things that we believe simply because they are convenient or they take the pressure off, rather than because they're true or useful in the long term. The devil was in the details, and this is another thing that is very easy to say but much more difficult to actually do. It has become cliché to label an idea as empowering, and it's perhaps more accurate to describe Sartre's notion of bad faith as terrifying, but it certainly gave me the shove I needed to take full control of my admittedly quite limited options. And it's inspired an ongoing project that I'm still working on to this day. But there was an ancient Greek philosophy that I found particularly helpful during this time, and it may not be the one that you're thinking of. 4. The Comfort of Impermanence. Heraclitus once famously said, "You cannot step in the same river twice." He was, according to Nietzsche, and possibly also David Hume, one of the wisest of the ancient philosophers, because he felt no need to make things secure and permanent, but instead embraced the notion of constant change. Partly thanks to Plato, our culturally common sense view on things today does tend to prize the permanent over the impermanent and the immutable over the changeable. But there is genuine comfort and insight into paying attention to what is continuously in flux, particularly with regards to suffering. I would spend many hours paying direct attention to my pain, seeing where it went, where it dwelt, when it intensified and when it subsided. I realised that part of what was causing my distress was that when the pain was temporarily subdued, I would subtly trick myself into thinking that this state would last forever. I would become emotionally invested in my own lack of suffering, which meant that when the pain returned, it felt more than just physically unpleasant. It felt like my own body was betraying me, breaking a promise that it had never actually made. This would add frustration onto the emotional pile, which only made my pain more acute, which in turn would intensify my anger, turning the whole thing into this pointless, vicious spiral. I eventually realised that I was just as distressed by the changes in my pain as I was by the pain itself. It was the cruel fluidity of it that made it seem like my life was entirely out of my hands. It occurred to me that my emotional attachments to a permanent state of being was only intensifying my difficulties. I was unconsciously always creating expectations for the next minute, hour, or day. Although I'd begun to settle into the idea that this pain was going to last a while, I was still constantly on the lookout for what might happen in the short-term future. And this forwards-looking approach is fantastic in all sorts of situations. No one can become a master strategist or a great financial planner by taking each minute as it comes. But when you're in a situation that you cannot escape, one that is making your life really quite unpleasant, then those expectations and plans simply become dashed hopes to add to a long list of dashed hopes. They're not doing us any good. The great pessimist Arthur Schopenhauer once argued that desiring that the future will turn out a certain way is both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it allows you to set ambitions and strive towards them, which is what makes a lot of people's lives worth living. But on the other, it sets a standard for reality to live up to, one that will potentially cause great suffering if fate fails to fall in line. It was of his opinion that the cause of suffering was at least partly desire itself, and especially desire for the future to be a certain way. Now, I'm not totally convinced of this view, but it is a fantastic philosophy for when you are, largely speaking, powerless. As Epictetus used to say, what we cannot change we have to learn to accept if we don't want it to torment us. And for the time being, acceptance for me meant letting go of this constant game of prediction and expectation, of hope and disappointment. There are times when dissatisfaction and intense desire are just the things we need to compel us to action. But this was not one of those times. For now, I would have to embrace some of those qualities that Nietzsche held in endless contempt. Acceptance and passivity born out of weakness. And I bring this up to make a larger point, because my philosophy for this period of my life would have to be vastly different to what I had previously held. When I was studying for my final exams at university, I would regularly work 14 to 16-hour days, 7 days a week. And then my entire worldview was geared towards what would give me the most energy. I would gather up every positive and negative motivator I could to propel me to endless activity. I have the pleasure of leaning more towards this philosophy now. But being sick and basically bedbound made me realise something that seems so obvious but we rarely say out loud. There is no perfect, permanent philosophy for life, and the consequences of this view are just what I want to move on to next. 5. Context, consolation, and philosophy. Perhaps the most classic philosophical question is, what is the meaning of life? And what this question is normally driving at is, how can I live a life that fulfills me? For a long time, the role of answering this question was given to religion. But as we said before, without this, the existentialist challenge arises. How do we create lives that are meaningful if there isn't a God? Famously, Jean-Paul Sartre and many other existentialist philosophers argued that if we're not finding meaning in religion, then a certain amount of subjectivity will enter the equation. That is, where objective meaning can no longer be found, we will have to create subjective meaning for ourselves. However, I want to build upon this further and argue that meaning is not only subjective but contextual. That is, the way to live a meaningful life does not just change between people, but also between times and situations in a person's life. I'm sure in some ways this might seem really obvious, but it challenges a conception that we often unconsciously assume when we ask questions like, what is the meaning of life? Even when we have let go of the idea of objective meaning, we still cling to the hope that there is some permanent subjective meaning that we might create. So we might not have God, but we could still find a fixed thing or set of things that we can always trust to bring meaning to our existences, whatever the situation and whatever stage of life we are at. But I think this may be a mistake. A philosophy appropriate for one time may be very different from the kind of approach needed at another. Famously, many people say that when they had children, their lives were imbued with a whole new dimension of meaning that they never thought was possible. And a friend of mine, who has lost his wife of many years, is now looking for new sources of fulfillment since the rock that grounded his life has sadly passed away. So far, so obvious. But I want to take a moment to think about the consequences of this. The popular picture of existential angst is that you have an existential crisis, then you find a source of meaning, and the crisis abates. We get this picture partly from Kierkegaard, who assuaged his own existential angst by his faith in Christianity, which, because of the role of an objective God, made context irrelevant. But if we concede that meaning is not only subjective, but context-dependent, then we get a very different picture, one that is a little terrifying, but also deeply relieving. Instead of the problem of a meaningful life being one that is solved forever like a maths equation, in this picture it becomes an ever-evolving issue. We cannot let the topic of our personal philosophies rest, but they must be constantly revised, changed, and developed to meet new situations and new challenges. A philosophy for being ill would not be the same as one for being well, and a philosophy for a time where we have power and vigour and energy would not be the same as one for when we are depressed and anxious. I'm sure some of you will recognise the echoes that this has with some of Nietzsche's lesser recognised philosophies. And part of the reason I bring this up is because today I see a lot of people offering permanent and definite solutions to how to live a meaningful life. Gurus of fulfillment dictating the proper way to live from on high. And I just want to encourage a gentle skepticism about this. In my humble opinion, the variety and complexity of human experience is too great to be reduced to a single approach. And the change and development that a person undergoes throughout their lifetimes means that not only will the answers to existential questions differ between people, but they will also differ across a person's timeline. It is one of the reasons why I cover philosophers on this channel that do not just disagree, but outright contradict almost everything that the other says. Camus might serve you very well for 10 years, and then a child comes along and you just can't fathom absurdism anymore. You might be able to have faith in a higher power like Kierkegaard, until something happens that shakes that belief at its very core, at which point Sartre might offer some comfort. You might be a devoted Stoic for 5 years, but then find you've lost touch with your deepest instincts, at which point Nietzsche offers a welcome balance. The philosophy I have now is very different to the one I held when I was at my sickest, and no doubt it will change over the course of the next 5 years. So perhaps we should be cautious about tricking ourselves into thinking that we have solved the problem of meaning in our lives, and thinking we can settle into a state where our existential troubles are over forever. There is a fresh situation with new philosophical challenges just over the horizon. But the good news is we're all in it together, and nobody has it all figured out. On this view, philosophy is not something to have once done, but something to continuously be doing. There is no paradise at the end, but there are little pockets of comfort on the way, and a process to help us find them. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want to hear more about some of the ideas I touched upon here, then click on this to learn about Camus' radical absurdist philosophy. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.